Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Doody, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune into Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea, at Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. Looking for an opportunity to tell your students' stories better? M. Stoner offers an 8-course on-demand series covering the essential elements of digital storytelling. Interested in learning more? We are tweeting out a link shortly with registration details. This broadcast is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover additional personal and professional development opportunities. I also want to take a moment to thank Kate Zula, who is actually in the studio with me right now, helping to monitor the back channel and forwarding to me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. And finally, I am very honored to have joined us today Kathy Adams Riester, Mahauganee Shaw, and Richard Dool. So I'm going to start off and ask each of you to please briefly describe your current role and one thing that keeps you up at night in regards to crisis management. Kathy, let's hit it off with you.
Hi, Tony, thanks. My name is Kathy Adams Riester. I'm Associate Dean of Students at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And in my role, I oversee parent and family programs. I oversee fraternity and sorority programs. And then also I work with our First Amendment and protesting on campus. So I would say the thing that keeps me up thinking about stuff right now is really the campus climate around protests on campus.
Excellent. All right, Mahauganee.
Hi, everyone. I am Mahauganee Shaw. I research crisis management processes for post-secondary institutions. Until recently, I was a faculty member at Miami University, where, among other things, I developed and taught a course on campus crisis management in the Department for Educational Leadership, really helping graduate students in the student affairs arena, as well as current student affairs professionals to hone their crisis management skills on campus. This year, I am spending it as a fellow for the Society for College and University Planning, where I will be focusing on a research project that really dives into campus memorials that commemorate tragedy and crisis on campus, kind of their purpose, how we use them, why we build them, and what it adds to the campus community.
Excellent, thank you. All right, Rick.
Hi everyone, my name is Rick Dool. I'm a director of a graduate program at Rutgers and a teaching professor. This is my pay-it-forward part of my career. I ended my corporate career of 30 plus years. Hopefully I don't look that old. At GE last March. I've been a CEO for 12 years of public and private companies. I had senior leader positions at AT&T and GE. So I've got the scars of crises to prove it over many years. And what keeps me up at night, I guess I would say I'm a lifelong student of leadership, and I'm appalled, frankly, at how poorly leaders manage crises, even today in 2017. I'll share some examples with that. You'd think we'd learned the lessons over time from good management of crises, but we don't seem to have learned them. So I'll share some examples a little later.
Can't wait to hear. Go ahead.
Can I jump back to, I forgot to answer the second part of your question, what keeps me up at night? So what keeps me up at night currently is watching this coverage of the Hurricane Harvey recovery and crisis management process. As someone who lived through Hurricane Katrina, and really that's kind of how I got into studying crisis management in the way that I do, it bothers me to see that so many of the same issues that were present in Katrina are present today as we deal with Harvey. And in particular, I've been working on research with some colleagues that goes down this realm, down this road, but how we see communities of color portrayed after natural disasters like Harvey, and how those communities and people of color just seem to be disproportionately impacted by such disasters.
Okay, I'm sure we'll have more conversation about that later on. So Mahauganee, I know we often use different vocabulary and it means different things to different people. So I'm hoping you can start us off and define and distinguish between terms such as crisis, critical incidents, disasters, emergencies, and so on.
Absolutely. So those terms get thrown around interchangeably a lot, as you just said. And the reality is that they are all really different ways of describing crisis, which is the central theme. So some researchers have come up with ways to kind of categorize crisis and levels of crisis. And so those terms really refer to different levels of a crisis event. A critical incident would be your lowest level event, usually within the realm of campus crisis management. When we're talking about a college community, a critical incident is something that only impacts a subset of the campus community. So say something happens in one building across campus, it doesn't impact the way that we operate on the rest of campus if it's really just that one building. When we go up the scale, sometimes the word emergency or campus emergency may be something that impacts the entire campus community. And then when we get to disaster, we're talking about something that crosses the borders of the campus community. So something that impacts not only the campus, but also the surrounding community. And right after Katrina, some emergency management researchers began to throw the word catastrophe into the mix. And so catastrophe would be basically the largest scale disaster. It shares the same characteristics of a disaster, but we see an increase in the severity, we see an increase in the media attention and in the number of resources and people that are needed to respond to it. So what we're watching right now with Harvey, catastrophe.
Gotcha. All right. So Kathy, let's focus in on campus crisis for a moment, and I want to ask you to provide some categories and perhaps some examples of crises that might occur on a college campus. And my follow-up is, has there been an increase in any particular type of crisis that you've seen on campuses?
Okay. So first, and Mahauganee did a good job of explaining the categories. So when we look at a critical incident on a college campus, it would be something like isolated to a particular building or area. So it could be like a small flood in a building or a fire in a building. It could be something maybe like the death of a student on campus, what might impact a certain area or certain group of students. With that. For a campus emergency, you're looking at something larger. So if you had like a large power outage on campus or something that like a protest, I think would maybe be in a critical incident area. But if you had like a large riot come through your campus that impacted campus business and may cause the shutting down of a college campus, that really gets into the campus emergency larger scale thing. And then as Mahauganee said, that the disaster it's not only impacting the campus, but it's impacting the local community. So I think when we've seen bad hurricanes, but maybe not at the level, or tornadoes on campus, or a lot of them tend to be more natural disasters, earthquakes, and that could probably go between a disaster and maybe the new catastrophe category. And all of those have, depending on the size of your institution, can have a big impact because sometimes your institution helps provide response when it's something larger in the community as well. And frequency, so I would say that I feel like we're seeing more natural disasters and weather type incidents that are impacting campuses that would have to be shut down. So for example, University of Houston needing to be closed because of the hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey. So I think that there's some weather incidents, but then anytime you get something larger, like a large protest or rioting. I mean, we see this around our national championships a lot of times that may not impact the full business of closing campus, but that happens. And then I think we're just seeing overall on the critical incident level more higher level activism, whether it be community or campus driven around the First Amendment. And that's one of the areas that I really focus on. So I think we're starting to see more of that type of activity. And Charlottesville is a good recent example of increased activism on a college campus.
So related to that, Rick, how has crisis management changed over the last decade or so? And what are some of the trends and issues that have affected how we currently respond to crises?
Well, I would say just to start, the last decade has probably created a crisis or a crisis-oriented environment. The media jumps on it right away. So the first big change is the scrutiny. the level of scrutiny is just dramatically higher, not only because of the rise of social media, but all the rise of all the media, outlets, including look at all the cable news efforts, et cetera. I mean, look at CNN, look at Fox. It's 24/7 these days. So scrutiny is higher. There's an outsized reaction to crises now, more than we saw in the past. The speed and pace is incredibly faster. There's more gray. And there's also a wider range of what's considered a crisis. It's not just Katrina or Harvey's. Now we're looking at a whistleblower or an ethical lapse or a key employee quits or a new competitor emerges out of the dark you didn't realize. So the range is dramatically wider. So that's causing another problem. And then the last thing I would say, there's just an environment of mistrust. There's an environment of a lack of trust in corporate entities and organizational entities. There's a sense of corporate greed, if you will. And there's a sense of like almost an expectation that there's going to be wrongdoing. And so you put all that together, it puts a lot of pressure on leaders in terms of crisis response.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that has been highlighted for me as I just listened to Kathy and Rick is that I don't think we haven't really defined crisis. So when we're talking about crisis, we really are talking about incidents that in any way impact an institution, and the ways that we categorize them. The categories are based on the level of impact to the institution. And so we are talking about an impact on human resources, on financial resources, on physical resources, and on reputation, right? So as Rick was just talking about corporate entities and competitors rising up in the industry and that being read as a crisis, we are talking about the different types of impacts that that events in the environment can have on institutions.
If I could also add there, the other challenge is that there's no cookie cutter approach to this. It's very contextual and very situational. So what you did last time may not work this time.
Absolutely.
Because of the technology and the speed of access and reach and the scrutiny, you can't just use plan A every time. It's just not going to work.
I mean, can I add something too? And so I think when Rick talked about the social media and the role social media and instant communication plays in crisis is definitely something that we feel on college campuses because, as soon as something happens, students are texting, Facebooking, Instagramming, like all of this stuff is coming out on social media, and their parents are linked to that. So our parents and family members of college students. So they're also expecting kind of instantaneous responses from our institutions. And sometimes they have very misinformation about what's occurring when that happens. So I think that has also changed the dynamics of the level in which a college campus or university is trying to respond to things, because you're getting all this stuff that may or may not be true without super factual information, because students are getting online and chatting about it and doing lots of things that get people really concerned about what's going on. And it may not be that high level of an incident. It becomes elevated because of that.
Yeah, we've had a few incidents here at Rutgers where if you don't get a hold of it in the first few hours, it becomes a story that you can't get back, right? You need to weigh in quickly. So I'd like to ask each of you to share with the audience a crisis that you have experienced or perhaps studied and the lessons learned from that crisis. So Richard, I'm going to start with you this time.
Well, I'd love to say there's not much, but there's too much. I mean, if you think about the last 2 or 3 years, I can give you 7 examples of poorly managed crises that you all know about. The Wells Fargo situation, Toyota, Governor Christie on the beach, the Samsung battery issue, the Fox sexual harassment. Well, I think I said Volkswagen in their issue, Milan's, iPen. There's so many out there, EpiPen, pardon me. There's so many out there. You'd think some lessons would be learned and would be deployed. But I watch these leaders make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So that's the first thing I would strike. The thing I learned in my own experience is how there's a lack of contingency planning. There's a lack of even thinking about the crisis. There's almost this overconfidence, cockiness, saying, okay, I'll think about the last 10 minutes and we'll be okay. It's almost like we like to be firefighters. We like to be, take pride in being reaction, and it's not enough proaction, if you will. So my biggest lesson, counsel corporate clients, I say, you know what? I know you think it's going to work, but just in case, humor me, and let's think a little bit about contingency. Let's think about a framework of response. I'll share more about that a little later. But the 2 points again is to repeat, there's way too many examples of poor crisis management, not enough good ones. And a lot of it comes down to the attitude and the arrogance of the organizational leadership team.
All right. All right, Mahauganee, you're up next.
So I'm sitting here trying to decide which one to talk about. And whether, because one would focus me more on response and one would focus me more on kind of the long-term recovery process. And while I'm tempted to talk about recovery, I think you asked about response. So that's what I'm gonna talk about. And so I spent quite a bit of time actually studying Hurricanes Rita and Katrina and how it impacted different universities and spending time on different university campuses in the Gulf Coast and learning about their process, how they worked through it, what worked well for them, what didn't, and what were the similarities between those institutions. And I would say that in terms of kind of larger picture lessons learned, one is that, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit later on, but one is that I think that in times of crisis, because of the media attention and because of the need to kind of respond to the general public, sometimes campus leaders forget that the internal audience is just as important. And so the communication that goes to campus employees, that goes to students and parents, is not the same as what's going out to the general public. So much attention and focus is put on how to prepare a statement for the media that people oftentimes are not communicating internally. And that then feels really bad to the people who are right there on campus and are learning new things on the evening news, rather than hearing it firsthand from the people who they are giving their all to, because in a time of crisis, it is kind of all hands on deck and people's institutional loyalty kind of goes through the roof in a lot of ways. And so one thing I think is that we got to get a handle on the communication processes. The other thing that I would say is that in a lot of ways, a crisis is, a lot of people think of it as a nuisance, but it really is an opportunity a lot of times to revisit what it is that you're doing within your institution and which of those things really matter and which of those things are really aligned with your mission and which things are taking you completely away from your mission. And a lot of times, if you're dealing with something that's at the disaster level, institutions kind of have to cut the fat, right? So they have to think about the ways in which they've experienced mission creep, the ways in which they are no longer, which they've picked up additional responsibilities and services that do not directly add to the mission, and to cut those things out so that they can focus specifically on their mission and so that they can educate their students in the way that they need to as they work through the recovery process.
All right. Kathy?
So for me, this is more of a study, although I actually experienced it. So in 2002 at the University of Arizona, we had a shooting on campus at our College of Nursing. And looking back at that, I mean, this was before you really had crisis response teams and management teams and things like that on college campuses. So I think for us at the University of Arizona, that really kind of started all of our, really deeper dive into emergency crisis management. I mean, that event was handled very well, but Mahauganee talked about communication issues. It happened up on our north part of campus. There's a major road that intersects, and I think people on main campus didn't understand or know what was going on when things were happening. So we really have worked on how do we communicate. We have our emergency text messaging systems now. We have a campus emergency response team that has really integrated our crisis and emergency response process on campus. And I think that was probably that happening in 2002 was a big instigator of really us looking at how we're responding to things and coming into a more comprehensive approach at the university and responding to it.
Great. All great examples. Thank you. Richard, I know you have studied and been part of the corporate culture and certainly dozens upon dozens of crises. And I know that the creme de la creme of crisis response in business management books is often pointed to as the Johnson & Johnson's recall of Tylenol capsules, and that they were instantly recalled. But we know that it actually took about 8 days after the first deaths were announced and after another Tylenol poisoning was discovered that they actually did something. So what is the new norm? I know it certainly isn't 8 days. How fast are we expected to respond to a crisis these days?
Well, let me make 2 points on the first thing you said. It's a shame that we're using as our exemplar a crisis management good example. It's almost 30 years old now. That's kind of a shame, isn't it? I think we'd have some better recent ones. And the reason they were so good at it is it was value-based. It was instant in the time of instant back then. And it was not only dealing with the crisis, but also dealing with the aftermath. And I'll come back to that later. But eight days is, it is obviously a lifetime these days. But 8 hours is a lifetime these days. If you go to the most crisis experts, they'll say you have to respond within the same day. I think that's nonsense. You got to respond within the same 2 hours, because as it was said by Kathy, with social media, everyone's going to take control of that message quickly. So you got to be out there, almost instantly. Now to do that sounds so good. That's hard. Because you have to have a crisis framework in place. You have to have a team that's responding, that can respond. You have to have a mechanism that allows it for someone to look at it quickly. You have to have somebody monitoring to watch it, even because you could be surprised by the crisis. So I would say it's almost instant, defined as within 2 hours or less, but you have to have these elements in place to make it work. Otherwise, it's going to be very haphazard and too reactive, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm sure that 2 hours is scaring quite a few viewers if they had to think about responding to something in 2 hours. But you're right. You've got to identify that it's happening first, right, on social media, and then you've got to identify what platforms you're going to communicate it across. Like, you can't do that when it happens.
I always tell people that, I tell my clients, I know you can't anticipate every crisis, of course, but get that. But you can have a crisis response or crisis framework ready. Who's going to respond? How are you monitoring? Who will craft the message? Who's got to look at it? You can have those elements in place to get going. And a lot of times, as I said earlier, without the lack of a contingency plan, they don't have the crisis framework in place either. They have overconfidence in their ability to react, and that's a shame.
Mm-hmm. And the reality is that first message that goes out doesn't have to be the most detailed message ever. 2 hours is a really good time frame to say you need to put something out there. And a lot of times that first message really is simply, we acknowledge that this thing happened. We are still collecting information on it. We will update you all as soon as we know more. Right? So, you kind of just acknowledge it so that the general public doesn't think that you're either ignoring it or trying to sweep it under the rug. And then you give people a time frame of when they can expect to hear from you. And then you need to make sure that you actually meet that time frame.
That's a good point, because in the absence of information, people are going to make up their own information and their own stories about what occurred.
Yep. And I think a good example of that, Tony, is, so we, I think probably about 2 years ago, there was a suicide that occurred on campus. And normally, I think most institutions have the practice of not releasing information about that. But in absence of that information, because there was a visible crime scene that was being investigated, students started making up their own stories of, could that, is someone running around campus killing people? And so in absence of sending out, even for something like that now, I think because of social media and things like that, they start creating their own stories and what ifs about what might be happening. So I think it's also changing the way that institutions are looking at responding to things, even crises close to campus, but not necessarily impacting campus. If students hear gunshots off campus and lots of sirens in the helicopter, they think something might be happening on campus. And if you don't, so we've talked about, do we put out messaging even of stuff saying there's no impact to students and things like that, so that people don't start worrying that something's happening on campus.
So, Kathy, Mahauganee touched on this before and suggested that we often focus a great deal on external audiences and stakeholders. Can you talk about the range of key internal and external stakeholders in a particular campus crisis?
Sure. So I think when you look at internal stakeholders, and I think Mahauganee's point was right on, that you need to look at your messaging, and the messaging that you give to internal stakeholders may be different than external stakeholders. So messaging to students, to faculty, to staff, if you have a board of regents or some type of group guiding, trustees guiding your institution, They probably also want to know what's going on, and the messaging to them about what they need to do and what's going on is probably going to be different than the messaging you're going to release to external stakeholders. You also probably need to determine where parent and family members of students fall within that. And today they're very closely linked to their students. I know I work, if we have any messaging that needs to go out to family members, I work on that messaging as part of my role with parent-family programs, and tweak it a little bit to be the messaging to our parent family members. And then you have the external agency, which might be your local community, your state, depending on what's going on. It could be your governor, your legislators. Overall, we already talked about Board of Regents, and then kind of the general community out there who are concerned about what's going on. I think colleagues at different institutions, nearby institutions also, sometimes they're offering aid and support as part of that. So I think you have definitely two different sets of messaging.
And how about students? What role can students play in providing leadership during crises?
So I think for students, a lot of our student leaders are trained in specific roles that can assist. So, we have our resident assistants in the residence halls. You might have student leadership. We have, I believe that if something comes up, we have our student body, president, graduate, undergraduate presidents would have a role in our campus crisis team. So I think part of it first for students is listening to any emergency messaging that's going out and doing what those instructions are. That's like the kind of the best starting thing. And then if a student has a particular role in that crisis, hopefully you've done really good training with them on what they need to do. And then they're undertaking those roles. I think our resident assistants and our residence halls in particular are a big part of that. We also have local EMTs, like a EMT group on our campus. So they are often called in to work just in general daily routes handling and addressing physical emergencies. So our EMTs would also be part of that response.
So Mahauganee, what functional areas should sit on a crisis management team, and what are some of the characteristics or competencies that team members should possess?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this question, and honestly, so there are some roles that some functional areas that across the board are going to be on pretty much every response team. However, institutional type and size really factors into this a lot of the time, because when we're dealing with smaller institutions, you have less people available to be able to manage a crisis and still tend to the daily operational tasks of the institution. Right. And so I would say that in general, you're going to have your campus safety, chief of police, whatever that role is for a particular institution. You are likely going to have representative from the Office of Residence Life. That is, assuming we're on a residential campus, right? It's going to be a representative from the Office of Residential Life. You're going to have someone, or should have someone, from the counseling center. Mental health is of key importance in an unfolding crisis and in the immediate aftermath and beyond, as well as your communications person, whoever is going to help shape those messages and make sure that the right messages get out to the right audiences and that we don't forget anyone. That person is important. Legal counsel is extremely important. Quite often, part of the reason why the messages that go out immediately are so lacking in detail is because legally we can't say more about what is happening, and we need more detail, and we're not allowed to share certain information. And so the role of the legal counsel is of chief importance right there at the beginning. I would say that probably those roles, I may be forgetting one, but I would say that specifically those roles are probably most important to be central. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not university presidents should be involved in that team. And the reality is that on a lot of campuses, the president is busy doing other things and has a good team who can handle those things, right? If you have the right people in place, the president doesn't need to be at every single meeting, but the president does need to be briefed and kept abreast of what's happening. And especially if the president is going to be the campus spokesperson when it comes to communicating with the media in different audiences, then she or he or they definitely need to be involved in what's happening with that team. And then the team can expand out from there depending on what the specifics are and what type of assistance is needed.
Kathy and Rick, any other folks to add to that list?
Yeah, so I would say, and sorry, Mahauganee, if you said this, but you need a financial person. So someone from the budgeting office that can procure and develop resources and authorize spending if you need to spend some money. And you probably need your facilities management team as well, kind of the physical plant people to also participate, because depending on what's going on, they know your systems, physical structures and systems on campus as well.
What I have learned is that a lot of companies and a lot of campuses and organizations do not consider the full array of stakeholders, both internally and externally. So I said before, I have a crisis framework. You should think of stakeholders writ large, both internally and externally, and broaden the group more than you think, even more than you're comfortable, because you never know who's going to have a voice and who could help you. And so I generally see it's too narrow a focus when I look at this.
That's a good point. I think sometimes we forget alumni are part of a community can help with our messaging, right?
Yes. I would also say that in terms of messaging, some things that have been highlighted is the impact that messaging can then have on enrollment for a campus in years to come, right? And so as we think about communicating with our current audiences, we have to also remember that prospective families and students are also part of that audience, right? People want to send their students away to a place where they feel that they'll be safe, that they'll be cared for, and that communication will be fast and will be clear if there comes a time where the campus goes through an emergency while their child is there. And so, quite honestly, this is a really difficult task for smaller institutions a lot of the time. A lot of the time, what we see when systems are overwhelmed with a crisis response is that smaller institutions actually have a much more difficult time communicating quickly with different audiences and getting in touch with parents or making sure that they've covered all of the bases, whereas the larger institution that typically we don't think of as necessarily like the family environment does such a good job at it. And then what happens is the larger institution will get more students the following year, and the smaller institution will suffer in terms of enrollment because of their lack of ability to respond. And that's where Richard's point about just having the protocols in place becomes so important, so that we can make sure that the information goes out in a timely fashion when something does happen.
So Rick, what are some good communication practices and what are some mistakes to avoid? You said that you could name a dozen examples of poor crisis management over the last year. So what are good practices and what are some of the mistakes to avoid?
Well, let's talk about the dark side for a second, because it's always more fun, right? The mistakes that are made, the examples I gave a bunch of them, but the latest ones, I would say, Volkswagen, for example, Wells Fargo, the Samsung phone. So the dark side of this is, and we see these behaviors all the time, we see stalling, we see denying, we see rationalizing, we see delaying, we see covering up, we see outright lies. I mean, these are things you obviously should not do, and yet we see them repeated over and over again. It's quite amazing to me. Now, part of it's a fear of litigation, part of it's fear of not knowing everything and getting out too soon. It's a mistake. All those things will end up costing you more and damage reputation capital worse, because all it does is extend the crisis. So if you don't want to, so obviously do the opposite of all that, right? So what does that mean? Well, the first thing is you have to frame this properly. You're dealing with the crisis at hand and you're dealing with the aftermath. You got to look at both sides. You can't just deal with the moment and ignore the future, because a lot of your reputation capital will be recovered in how you deal with this afterwards. Changes you make, how you embed this in your process and rebuild your reputation. So I would say deal with the reaction and deal with the aftermath first. The second is attitude. I call it the 3 C's. Be calm, be in control, and be confident, but have a dose of pragmatism, have a dose of empathy, have a dose of desire to solve the problem. You have to kind of balance both. You can't come across as weak or timid or not unsure. That doesn't work. And then in terms of communication, we talked about this, right? Get out quick. Always be honest and accurate in whatever you do say. I'll come back to what you shouldn't say in a little later. And make sure that, as was said, get out there on a regular basis. And when you say you're going to do something, you got to do it. You can't make it worse by saying you're going to do something and then obviously don't do that, because that just extends it. And you'll find the media, they parse every word. They'll grab see what happens to Trump, ignoring the politics of them. They're parsing every single word, every single phrase. It happens all the time. The scrutiny is checking everything. So recap, deal with your action. The aftermath, be calm, controlled, confident, but also be empathetic and sympathetic. Be apologetic if appropriate, and obviously get out there quick with a framed message, which I'll talk about it more in a second.
So Mahauganee brought this up earlier, and Rick, I think you have an opinion on this. Who should be the spokesperson during a major campus crisis?
Well, Tony, I have a strong opinion on this one, of course. I think the senior leader has to be out front most of the time. Not 100% of the time. That's just not practical. But I want to see the top man or woman. That's what I want to see. I want to have confidence they're in control, and they're focused on it. It's their priority. If it's not their priority, I got a problem. All right. So that doesn't mean we can't have spokespeople. That doesn't mean we can't have subject matter experts as appropriate. And we talked about the array of stakeholders. Bring them in as needed. But I want the top person out there. I want to know, because I'm betting the ranch that this is going to get turned around on him or her. And I don't want to see them in a fleetingly manner, see them every once in a while. I want to see them up front. So that's one man's opinion, but I strongly feel that way. I see the spokespeople overused, and I think that's usually a mistake.
Kathy, Mahauganee, any thoughts on it?
Are you going?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Good. Okay. I tend to agree with that. I would say that I can see sometimes when the senior leader has not been the person who has been out in front of the cameras when something has happened. And in those incidents, you always kind of see that person eventually just kind of fade to the background or off to the side, or they're no longer with the institution. I do think that it's important for people to see and hear a strong message coming from the person at the top, and for the people who are a part of the campus community to feel support coming from the person at the top. When that person is not, for whatever reason, able to be the one who delivers the messages, I do think that it hurts their ability to lead the community.
I may just add another point on this. I apologize to any lawyers listening, but sometimes lawyers, when they get involved in crisis, will try and downplay, minimize, or mitigate a message. I want the top person in charge, because I want that person that can make a decision, say what to do. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's watered down when spokespeople get involved or some of the stakeholders get involved, and we let them have too much of an opinion, if that makes sense.
Right. All right, Kathy, so what are some, I know you've probably worked on these at Arizona or as part of the commission through ACPA. What are some of the components of a comprehensive student affairs crisis response plan? And I'm curious, what individual in a student affairs team do you think is best equipped to actually take the lead in this and put this together, or has the time to do it?
Okay. So I'm going to own my large institution perspective on this. So I think what I'm saying may change depending on the size of your institution. So we're with graduate and undergraduate, we're about 40,000 students at the University of Arizona in a community with about a little over 1 million people in Tucson. So our we have in place through our campus emergency response team. So first, regardless of what your area is, you should have a continuity of operations plan. Every unit in your institution should have some type of plan of what happens if there's some type of campus emergency. Who are your critical people that have to be on campus or have to be contacted, who would not come to campus. Having that continuity of business plan is super important. I also think you need, we have a pandemic plan. So if there's like things like the H1N1 flu virus, you have lots of people who are sick. So you need not only kind of the campus crisis physical, but you need to think about health crisis. You also need to think about cyber attacks. So universities are not immune to those, and they get stalled or shut down, and you need a plan for that as well. What happens if there's some cyber issues coming up on your campus? I mean, we've seen great examples of this in business, and I think higher education is probably keeping a little bit more quiet, but they're being attacked as well within that. And then from my perspective, as part of the campus emergency response team on my campus, we have a lot of student affairs areas that are involved as part of that team. And I think it just depends on where people report on different campuses. So we have residence life, we have the student unions, and people who can procure food, water, resources like that, having a back supply should we need it. having our CAPS, our Counseling and Psych Services, as well as Campus Health Services, are part of our Student Affairs Division on campus. I represent parent-family programs, so I'm kind of the communication arm for our families on campus, as well as working around First Amendment issues. So if we have things coming up about protests or rallies or things like that, I represent that. So a lot of the areas in our Student Affairs Division have some type of representation on campus. Residence Life also is part of our unit. So I think, and the leaders of our team are our Senior Vice President for Student Affairs, Melissa Vito, is a co-leader with our Chief of Police, Brian Seastone, and our Dean of Students is also on our team. So I think it depends on the size of your campus, but ultimately, those are also all areas, depending on what happens, that would need to be activated to have a response.
So Mahauganee crisis management plans obviously take time to develop, test, refine. What gets in the way of effective crisis communication management? And how does senior leadership instill a sense of urgency? Right, we've all got lots of things to do. We've got lots on our plate. How do we get folks to pay attention to this and have it rise to go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that the lack of a sense of urgency is the key reason why a lot of plans don't exist in places that they should. The reality is that if you're working on a campus, on a college campus, regardless of whether you're in academic affairs, student affairs, or somewhere in between, you have any number of things drawing on your time in a way that does not make planning for the potential of some disaster, some environmental disaster, or a campus shooter, or a protest, or a virus outbreak, or any number of things that come few and far between. Those things don't elevate to the level of importance because, like, you know, we have students who are showing up this week or who just showed up last week. And that is what's really important right now, because that we know is going to happen. This other thing, we don't know if it's going to happen. And therefore, it's easier to push it to the back burner. The reality is that I think that leaders just need to lead. I mean, the reality is that if your campus leaders say that this is a priority for everyone. Right? And so campus leadership can actually set the priorities for the campus and to say, we expect for every unit to have their own protocols that align with the overall university plan by this date, right? And they can put things in place to help offices prepare in that way. A lot of times, the plans that you'll see on different campuses will vary based on campus characteristics and location and things like that. Campuses, in creating the plan, go through the process of trying to determine what are their most likely events, and then you create protocols for those specific events, but they are also protocols that can be adapted to other events if they come up, right? So in California, they are more likely to have a plan for a mudslide or a wildfire than you're going to get in the Midwest, right? In the Midwest, you're gonna see plans for tornadoes, maybe sometimes earthquakes. California might also have earthquakes, but you're not gonna necessarily see a hurricane plan in the Midwest, but you'll see it in the Gulf Coast, right? And so campuses have to plan for the types of incidents that are likely to happen to them. And the way to do that is really to just set the expectation that it's going to happen. Because the reality of the way that calendars are set up for people who work on college campuses is that there's never enough time. There's never going to be enough time to sit aside and say, now we're going to spend this afternoon planning for the unknown. Right. And so you just kind of have to make it a priority and do it.
Yeah. Can I add, Tony? So I also think once you're done planning, your group needs to meet and work. And it's not a plan that just sits on the shelf. So I think, so we have a campus emergency response team, and we meet on a monthly basis during the academic year. So we're looking at, you know, are we updating processes and procedures if something has changed? If there have been emergencies or crises on other campuses, we'll look at that and say, how does our plan match up with what, you know, was found, what worked well and what didn't work well there. So we're talking about this process, training new people. You know, people come and go at an institution, and you might lose someone in a critical role on your team. So bringing in and making sure everyone's up to par on the training of following. We use the NIMS system, so following policy procedure on that. So it's also not something that just should sit on your shelf until something happens. I think you need to have a group that's at least thinking about it, talking about it, assessing what's going on around the country as part of that. So you're not really done when you're done writing it.
So
absolutely. And go ahead. Nothing. I was just going to just put a star on what Kathy just said about the fact that, you know, there's constantly things in the news, right? Campuses in the Gulf Coast that were lucky enough to not be in an area that is heavily impacted by Harvey should be reviewing their hurricane plans right now. Campuses across the country, as we watch Charlottesville, should be reviewing their First Amendment plans, their campus protest plans. They should be looking at campus climate to see if something like that is even likely to happen at their institution. There's all kinds of ways for us to pay attention to current news and to then base our plans or to review our plans based on what's happening in other places and to learn from their lessons.
So what I was going to say is, so if you bring together a group to do that, is that something that should occur once a year, twice a year, once a month, once a week? What's the frequency of those kind of risk audits?
I would say that the planning, like the full review of the plan, needs to happen at least annually. Annually, we should be looking at the plan and saying, does this still work given our current context? But in terms of those kind of in-between reviews, I think it depends on what's happening in the environment, right? Is there something that makes us think that this plan is outdated now? Has something changed within our structure that makes it necessary for us to update the plan? If so, then we need to update it when it makes sense. But if not, you know, just watch the news and plan based on what you see happening across the country. In terms of the crisis management team and them meeting and being prepared to respond, the team it is and what the main goal of the team is, like if it's a behavioral intervention team versus an actual crisis response team, which sometimes those things exist separately, then the behavioral intervention team is probably meeting weekly, right, to discuss what's happening on campus and to bring in new cases of campus community members who are of concern for some reason.
I'll give you a practice that I saw used and I recommend to clients all the time. We used to do at GE when I was there, we used to do a once a quarter what if meeting. And it was no agenda. We got senior leaders and our key stakeholders, and we just sat around the table for 2 hours. That's all it was, 2 hours a quarter. What would we do if this happened? And we just put on a chart some likely things that could happen, and how would we put that framework that I mentioned earlier. It was very useful time. Rarely do we actually have to do it, but it made everyone feel like they're at least semi-prepared and at least had some thought about it and could anticipate. So it's a good team building practice and a good crisis management practice.
We also use tabletop exercises, usually at least once a year. And sometimes we've actually enacted particular scenarios of crisis where it's more than just a tabletop. It's kind of some physical stuff happening in an area. So we practice closing down buildings and having, an alleged threat in the area. So I think it's also good to exercise, whether it's what if meeting or tabletop, to ensure that, the plans that you have also work well when you put them into action.
That's a good point. So we have a plan in place. Are we putting on the calendar opportunities to drill and practice whatever those protocols are? Yep. So Richard, I'm intrigued. You said that you were going to share what you shouldn't say. I'm dying to hear what you should not say.
All right. So this is a point that I try to make with clients all the time. You're going to be told by lawyers to say minimum, virtually nothing, right? And that doesn't work. But then the opposite happens. Let's say everything. Well, it's not a good practice, nor is it even ethically or legally required. You have to reveal all at once. But whatever you do say, sorry, there's a siren going on right next to me here. Hope that's not a crisis. So whatever you do say, I think was said earlier, it better be accurate and honest. All right? But you don't have to reveal all at once. And I always try to tell clients, parse your messaging, appropriate response, hold your fire a little bit, make sure you get your facts. So what you should not say is certainly never lie, never exaggerate, never deliberately mislead, but you don't have to reveal all either. And a lot of times clients, they have trouble with that balance. And I counsel them all the time saying, why do you need to say A, B, C, and E? Why can't you hold E a little later, when it's more appropriate, or you have more information? Does that make sense? I think that they tend to go too much or too little, nothing in between.
So I heard you say earlier you should apologize if appropriate. Is that putting the institution or organization at risk from a legal perspective?
A lot of times the lawyers will tell you yes, and of course it could happen at times because people would take that as some kind of admission of responsibility. You can be empathetic and be apologetic without admitting guilt. And that's not that hard to do. If you have to have that frame of mind, you have to be willing to do it. Now you can put in a couple words to mitigate it from a legal standpoint, but you do not want to use the bland, basic, black and white response that the lawyers will typically give you, because that just doesn't work in this scrutiny, in this media hyped environment. So you want to find the balance between just enough, showing proper empathy, potentially apologizing, or getting close to it without putting yourself at risk. And I think that's manageable. Unfortunately, a lot of times the fear just puts you, dissuades people from saying anything. And that's a mistake, because at a minimum, you've got to show sympathy and empathy no matter what. That has to be there.
And I would say, echo what Rick says, and I think Mahauganee said this earlier, when you're on a college campus, in particular, the families of our students want to know that you care about their safety, and their safety and well-being is your first priority. So I think you need to have, if there's something tragic that's happened on campus or that's threatening their safety, you need to have a certain amount of empathy and feeling about that and how you're responding, or they're going to think you don't care about their kids.
I hate to say this because I don't want to use Trump examples, but CNN all morning was beating Trump up over because he didn't mention the victims in his speech yesterday. Whether that's right or wrong, the point is you're going to be under so much scrutiny. Every word you say is going to be looked at. So you have to think about the holistic view of the message.
So speaking of the messages, we got a Twitter message question from Cody Miller, and they ask, how do you engage social media platforms in crises? With what frequency and which platforms should you prioritize? Anyone, any thoughts?
Well, I think the question about prioritization depends on where your audiences are. And most institutions should have a handle on that before a crisis happens, right? Where does the institution have a social media presence? What channels has the institution spent time developing? And those are the ones that you go to, right? If you post a lot on Facebook, or you have Facebook groups that are specific to the institution, or if Twitter is the way that you get things out, then those are the platforms that you should go to. A crisis is the wrong time to begin trying to build new platforms.
The only comment I make on that is, and I agree with that, but you have to almost be ready to hit all of them, because you got to figure out where the crisis is emerging. If it's emerging in Facebook, you got to be there. If it's emerging in Twitter, you got to be there. So you have to monitor them all, and you got to go where the crisis is hot at that moment. So I definitely agree with Mahauganee's point, but you really have to look at all of them. That's the reality of today, unfortunately.
And I would add, don't overlook things like your institutional website and institutional email listserv reaches, because while the social media might be where students and some parents are, depending on the type of media, a lot of people may also turn to the institutional website. So I think our site, if there was a crisis, we have ability to put up just a crisis front to our page that would address particular issues around that crisis as part of it. And then we also know that what parents will look at on social media and families of our students and what students will actually use is also really different. So not a lot of our Facebook as an institution, that's not really where students are getting their information. So it's like Snapchat, it's Instagram. So you also need to think about the different modalities, which you may or may not be using of social media depending on the audiences that you want to reach. And then we have an institutional listserv, we have a messaging that goes out that reaches about 50,000 kind of alumni and some parents and things like that. So you also think about what other resources do you have, via email and other formats.
Right. And it's easy enough for institutions these days to just kind of have a ghost page that is there and ready for the website to be put up and tailored to whatever type of situation. So that page can already be prepared ahead of time. And then you can just kind of drop in the specific details for what's happening and get it up there quickly. The reality also is that we do need to think about whether or not, as we think about the parents and families of students, whether or not these people even have access to the internet and are able to get messages that are put up via the internet. So we do have to be thinking about what are the other ways. The reality is that you also need to set up that call center on campus, because campus is going to be flooded with calls, and sometimes that might be the only way that parents and families are able to get updates, or they may be subscribed to the text messaging system on campus. So making sure that the text messaging system is tested often and frequently enough to make sure that it's actually able to work in a time when phone lines may be overloaded, cell towers may be overloaded, and that we're able to get those messages out to audiences that communicate in different ways.
That's a great point. I remember when Hurricane Sandy came through the Northeast, cell phone service went down, and social media was the only way that we could communicate with parents and students and other stakeholders. So having redundancy plans for communication is for sure an important consideration. I have one last quick question before we go to our final question from Mike Piacentino from University of Miami. Asks, who defines a crisis? And because crisis can be perceived by different stakeholders, how do you convince leadership that you are at a level or state of crisis?
This is a critical point, and this gets in the way a lot. Remember I said earlier, it's contextual and situational. So what I consider crisis, you may not. And that's where these what-if teams that we used to do to get together, and we would define what is a crisis in our context. And it's not just environmental crisis or natural disasters. As mentioned earlier, it could be institutional. A key employee quits, a competitor comes up, you have a product that fails, you have a whistleblower. It's a whole range of these things, but you have to keep it in the situation that's contextual. So there is no quick answer, but essentially the team has to decide. They have to figure out together what they consider a crisis.
Mm-hmm. I think I agree with that. And I think that one nuance maybe in Mike's question, I don't really know if this was there or not, but a group within a campus community that sees a particular incident or situation as a crisis, and that is not being recognized at the same level by campus administration, which is a lot of times when we see student protests come into place, right? We see students or other groups on campus saying, finding platforms to raise their voices and to say, this is important to us. And so I think that if it's a bottom up type situation like that, then it is important for you to still be able to define what it is that makes this a moment of crisis, and to be able to articulate that in a way that that your audiences can hear and can understand. And so if you're trying to communicate with senior administrators, really being able to make the case in a language that they can understand. And we're to go into that right now.
So we're down to our final few minutes. So in 60 seconds or less, can each one of you share a few resources, websites, books, conferences, newsletters, associations, that can help the audience continue to learn about some of the topics and explore some of the issues around campus crisis management and communication that we've covered here today. Let's start off with Kathy.
So I'm going to put in a plug. Actually, both Mahauganee and I helped start for ACPA the Commission for Campus Safety and Emergency Preparedness. So it's a great commission, and it offers resources. We actually have a series of articles coming out for members that are going to be in ACPA Developments, which is the online subscription. And I co-authored with Ann Newman an article called Crisis Communication, Keeping Parents and Family Members in the Loop, that I think will be out sometime in the spring, but I think we have about 3 or 4 articles. So I would say that. The other thing is, I would say there are some great national training models. So the NIMS model that I mentioned, depending on what your campus is going to use, there's some nice set models when you're developing your plans of chain of command and how things should happen. So if you're starting kind of from ground zero, take a look at that.
All right, Mahauganee.
Yes, so I figured Kathy would plug the commission. So I will say that if you are a student affairs person who is listening in and you're a NASPA member rather than an ACPA member, that NASPA also has the knowledge community on campus violence and something prevention. I forget the full name, but NAPFA has an equivalent group that you could join and become a member of and get resources from as well. Also, I would say that kind of on a national front, if you're looking for information that kind of spans outside of higher ed, that there are lots of groups and associations that you can look into. I would suggest the IAEM, the International Association of Emergency Managers, or the Natural Hazard Center in Colorado, which actually has an online library that is freely accessible to anyone who has internet access and can get to their website, where you can look up various resources in regards to emergency management and kind of filter it by specifically what you're interested in. And then there's several books that focus either on emergency management, the history of emergency management broadly for the US, or crisis, campus crisis management in particular. There are a couple that kind of student affairs administrators just kind of keep on their desk in particular, some titles that are really important for that.
Great. All right, Rick.
So just on a general crisis management approach, the Deloitte Crisis Management Center, which is a website that has good stuff. The National Center for Crisis Management has some good stuff. There's 3 good books I've used. One called Damage Control by Eric Desenhall. Another one's called 4 Stages of Highly Effective Crisis Management by Jane Jordan Meyer. And the third one is Managing Crises by Rosenthal, Bone, and Comfort. All really good books. All give you a wide perspective on crisis management.
Excellent. And I'm going to try and take all these great resources and throw them up on the website so that people can link and get to them quickly. So thank you, everyone. I really, really enjoyed the different perspectives that you all brought to the conversation here today. Thanks, as always, also to our sponsors. Heather Shea will be back next week discussing the events in Charlottesville and the continuing reality of white supremacy in higher education. I'll be back a week later to discuss the topic of implicit bias and inclusive language. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Doody. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.